He dreamed that the tower shuddered with every impact. From the fog which had rolled in along the river, great golden arcs shot out, shaking the whole world with every hit. The arrows smashed the window above his crouched body, spraying glass across the room. As he peered through the broken frame, he heard a long, undulating call, and at the edge of the mist, a rider draped in furs and silks on a sable pony, giving a long, mournful call as he strung his bow with a strange arrow, straight line of steel, ornamented with stiff triangular red feathers and checkered black and white. Through dark metal corridors, as long as the guts of the whale that swallowed Jonah, he ran. The tower above burned and crumbled. In the hallways, men grabbed rifles and hid behind crates. The gallop of unshod horses pounded the dirt above him, mixing with the sound of the calls from horns. From the corner of his eye, just beyond his heaving left breast, he could see a white stag keeping pace with him, sliding around corners, ducking the arrows and jets of flames that the horde shot after them. If he could reach the surface, if he could climb the smoldering tower, if he could inhale the free air of the sky, he might still fly away from the ruin. He felt with each pained gasp of stale subterranean air that it was finally over. He knew he would fall and collapse, and he yearned for the succor of a killing blow to end his torment once and for all. But with each turn, he remained just out of reach of the grasping leather gauntlets, the hard tan hands reaching for his scalp and missing by hairs. He knew then that he had reached it. No dive into the blue, no soaring on the updrafts away from the flames waited for him. He dropped his shield, tossed his medicine kit behind him, even throwing away his precious briefcase into the wind, anything for speed, in search of lightness. But already the great vacuuming gusts were pulling his pursuers, their steeds, their arrows towards it. Some huge black maw yearned, calling all its children home, hidden there under the yellow sands. Waves of charnel, him, the riders, the viscera of 100 nations, sucked down into a deep gullet. And there, the rail, splashed with guts and shards of torn muscle, was broken. Horses loud beside him. Already, there was no time to think, only time to act. Don't think, act. Hot muscle in his leg, clenching, unfolding, pushing, pulling, leaping forward, the willed impulse shooting down every nerve. There was a gentle thump, followed by somebody's soft swearing, and then the wood panel door was flung open. A flustered-looking man, strung up to a food cart by his belt, stared in shock for a moment. "Fuck," was the first word that came from the man's mouth, and was followed, in the same matter-of-fact tone, with a brief apology and an excuse about how stalled trains were different than moving. "I'm very sorry for the inconvenience, sir," the trolley man said, as he was getting to the act of leaving the compartment free of any embarrassment or inconveniences, when a devilish thought struck him. "Look here, my man, can't you see the epaulets? You see that thick gold bar here? Look a little closer there. Yeah, that's right, you've interrupted a commodore sent out from the capital." At this, the trolley man began to express discomfort, and his eyes shifted. "Now to me, this looks like it could be some spy trying to sneak into matters of high office. Government security, you understand, and that poses quite a threat to me. So what kind of gestures of good faith can you offer to assuage my doubts, eh?" Dropping his gaze to the cart's liquor cabinet and shifting his arms, which had been lolling adrift innocuously, with open palms pointing at the bottles within. The trolley man's gaze darkened under heavy brows, and then clicked with some animal comprehension. Of course, Mr. Commodore, sir. No offense intended, none at all. Perhaps I can offer, sir, some of the finest farm liquors, bought from the neighboring estates only yesterday. Compliments of the train line." Having got the unfortunate serving man where he wanted him, Joe decided that 2 bottles would be satisfactory as a gesture of faith, compliments to the train crew for their professionalism, no offense taken at all, and so on, whereupon the unfortunate man handed over the bottles and scuttled off as quickly as possible. He poured out a few fingers of the clear, strong-smelling stuff from the corked glass bottle, sniffed it suspiciously, wet the tip of his tongue with it. There were 2 basic mysteries here. Firstly, the train was stopped. Why? Secondly, who was selling this god-awful hick drink in the passenger liner in the middle of this god-forsaken country? He downed the glass and winced. The moonshine tasted as bad as it smelled. He poured a couple more fingers out. At least it was free. He reached for the briefcase. He wanted to spend some time with the Navy maps, all the charts of data from the census about farms and taxes, all the reports he could find from the territory. Maybe there was something, demographic, geographic, political, that could explain the 2 coincided mysteries. It was silly, all right, but this was his vacation. He was on a stalled train, and reading about the people here and trying to map them over the mythic pioneers who had conquered this once wild and untamed land, well, it was always a voyage in and of itself. He hoped it was only 2 nights later, a young moon waxing slowly towards another fall harvest, and tins of brown pie and empty bottles of farm whiskey rolling on the floor of the stalled train cabin. The urge to do something besides drink over his damn maps had been growing for the period of confinement. Before leaving, he followed the archaic regulations religiously, leaving his blue uniform jacket inside, covering his coat lapels and epaulettes, and left his badges off. Rank didn't need to draw attention to itself during unexpected delays in this country, even if it were mostly pacified. His head felt naked, with its mound of thick dark hair left bare. He hadn't planned on more than a single night on this train, but indulgently he had purchased a fancy solo compartment with a bed, very fortunately, in hindsight, given this endless delay. Not many sodbusters or immigrants looking for a farm traveled this late in the year, but many people were still traveling to family farms to help with harvests, to new posts as soldiers, and the occasional thin, dark man hovering just on the corner of his vision. Better for his sore back to have a full mattress length than to be like those people draped over the cushioned seats. He'd had enough hours, curling and uncurling and slouching to the floor in cramped positions for a lifetime by the time he was 30. He could have a bed now, and damn the people in the chairs, he would. Still, as he reached the last carriage, head dully aching, maybe he hadn't had enough of the hair of the dog, and he thought how restoring it was just to see people. People in low voices discussing, lovers locking eyes, old women nervously watching grandchildren, young men pulling coats over their heads and feigning indifference to the world around them. A rainbow of life, lit by the train lamps and the purple dark, stretching across the eternal plains. Checking the gleaming gold pocket watch under the crackling yellow lamplight at the back of the carriage, he saw it was not even 9. Down the track, stretching out to the west, a hangnail of a gold-dusted moon was still sinking, and in its delicate glow he could see the outlined copses of yew and ash dotting along the track, and then 50 feet odd over, the freight lines. They were still, after all these years of settlement, trying to turn the desolate plain into a home, a forested garden. The yearning for a cigarette struck him, but he only had an empty pipe in his cabin, so he drummed his hands against the cool wrought iron of the platform. Across the fresh air of the autumn night, some high hollers sounded, and a clench in his stomach. wolves somewhere far in the distance between the groves that signified farmhouses. Sudden movement on the tracks. Between the train and the moon, pulled his eyes down along the beams of shimmering steel towards the dark stands of spruce and oak which shaded out the moon. A flash of shadow over them revealed an old man out on the rail, gray and tired, with a thin, unlit cigar hanging from his mouth, crowned and shaded by sun-beaten piece of slouching leather polished by the setting moon. In the crags of plain, hardened skin and darkest shadow, a single eye stared out, almost yellow in the dark, blinked, and then it seemed to be a glowing flinty blue. The man was covered with a long woolen poncho, hints of dazzling geometries in white and black, now aged into a nearly gray uniform. At his crouching feet was a patch of flowers which had forced themselves up between the stones and the rails to unveil their delicate autumn colors in a dapple of light, and it flourished amidst the shadow of the track's ballast's rugged geography. Wordlessly, Joe reached through the railing and flicked his lighter open for the man, who dipped a stick of leaves into the flame and pulled out an ember. Harsh tobacco smoke, from a wild local variety, floated into his nostrils, tingling there. Already rings of smoke were circling the old man, although there seemed to be no breath coming from him. With a gesture full of surprising fury, barely contained by old muscles, the one eye knelt and ripped a full plant from blossom to bulb out of the rail bed of quartz rocks. Shadow covered the whole of the man's face, leaving only the glowing orange cigar point which floated in the night. A raspy and high voice scraped out of the dark figure. "A false saffron! You do well to stay away from it. Does nasty things to a man's insides." And he tapped the dirt-covered bulb. A last ray of moon danced over the old face, catching scars like tears which trickled down from where his eye should have been. For a half-second he bared a yellow-fanged grin, and Joe got the impression he was a veteran of this land, although he seemed the wrong age to have been in the thick of any fighting around here. He tossed the bulb and the flower towards a little clump of yew and ash saplings that Joe hadn't noticed before, hidden by the shadows. The old fellow knelt again, this time ripping a clump of the bulbs up. These seemed unnaturally larger than before, and against the starlit night, the purple of the petal tips which bled into their pearly white bases were barely visible. "You can call it a crocus to amuse some young thing," the man said, gesturing towards the train, or maybe beyond it, and handed the bouquet to Joe, adding, "But save the bulbs. You never know when you might need it," maliciously winking as he said. This was too much for Joe, too witchy, bordering on the pagan, and he intended to ask the man his business. Directing his gaze downward for a brief second to check that his holster still hung heavy, he caught a flash of dark against the midnight, and turned back, finding nothing but rustling grasses and flitting shadows. Harsh odors of tobacco faded on the wind, and he took the plants and tucked them into his coat pocket before returning to the train. Sidling up to the dining car's cafe bar, he mulled over the encounter. Judging from the stranger's slight accent, he'd been a homesteader, probably a Dane or something. Nothing strange about that, per se. All kinds of people wandered their ways out into this wild, looking for fresh land. Still, the man had seemed like a grim veteran, too knowledgeable about local plants, not a soft city dweller or newly arrived farmer looking for somewhere to ripen his wheat. And what had he been doing hanging around a stalled train? He voiced this last question aloud to the steward behind the counter who was busy preparing coffee. Well, sir, meaning his lack of insignia meant little among the staff, I reckon it's just one of the farmers, maybe an Olson. As he cleaned the grounds out of the coffee machine, he explained that when a train stalled out, especially at this time of the year, farmers from nearby would sell their harvest at super premiums to the stranded lines. And can the bigwigs back in the offices afford to risk their permits and their customers by stiffing them for food? It's out and out extortion, if you ask me. And nothing less than the rail companies deserve, given the rates they charge, another passenger at the table chimed in. He noted that another one of the other diners was a thin, dark figure, scarred cheeks, black gloves on even in the mild weather, who seemed fixated on a little notebook. Joe remained silent, not knowing where things stood, and sat thinking about this situation over his coffee. Pounding iron on iron rang like a clock every 2 hours. Freight cars full of cattle in one direction and fertilizers in the other moved ceaselessly, unmolested by whatever force delayed his train. There was some reason they were stopped, surely. The surety of the freight was a comfort. It let him sleep better in the intervals than he would have if it had been uncertain. A change, sudden, in the schedule, woke him early, the dawn light only just beginning to glow on the eastern horizon, turning it a robin's egg blue, which felt too delicate for the early autumn. Outside, the clatter of horses sounded along the rail track. By his watch, it was 6:50 in the morning. He rubbed the ridges of stubble forming on his cheeks, hoisted himself halfway up, peering through the foggy window glass out across the plain. 30 head of horses and their riders, dressed in blue denims and caramel leathers, circled towards the engine at a half-canter pace. Though the riders were quiet and focused on their horses, the clatter of hooves against the quartz railway ballast rang out across the dewy landscape. Joe reached for the holster slung across the foot of his bed and checked that the magazine was full of brassy shells. Stumbling out into the hallway in a dirty undershirt, clutching his pistol, still half wrapped in its leather, he almost tripped over the scarred, black-shirted man who had been taking notes the night before. Neatly dressed in the same pressed black cloth as he had been then, he cut an unflappable figure compared to Joe's panicked, bedraggled appearance. But then he couldn't have known about the riders circling around, the glints of metal among their group. Joe motioned a finger over his lips, gestured towards the far side of the train, but all the windows there were obscured by compartments. The man in black shrugged, turned, and strode confidently towards the dining car, heedless of the warning. Joe lunged towards the man, grabbing at his elbow, but he was met with a smack from a gloved hand. He sat back, stunned, expecting to hear the shatter of a window pane and the report of a gunshot from the next car at any second, but silence reigned over the early morning. He twisted his body around the dark varnish of the panel, gingerly eyeing the external world across his hastily abandoned compartment. It was silent and still, and aside from the ripples of wind that pulsed waves through the amber fields of grasses, rye or barley, certainly not corn or wheat, but that didn't mean it was uncultivated. He thought again about the intelligence charts he'd been staring at, but the memory... Something about farmers' debts. Taxes, maybe. Something that hadn't added up. The memory was obscured behind a glaze of liquor-soaked glasses. Continued silence from the dining car, the absence of any disruption or change, convinced him that he must have been dreaming. Perhaps, maybe something from the fog of sleep. Maybe the shifting of rock below the tracks, it sounded like the clatter of hooves. He pulled himself back into his compartment, closed the panel door, and pressed himself in. After dressing himself, he double-checked his pistol, still sitting heavy with brass in his holster, and he pulled his boots extra tight. Joe decided to take the cup of black coffee, alone in its deathly white porcelain plate, to the back platform of the train. The slight chill of the early autumn was fading into the honey glow of a morning sun as he started puffing away at something that smelled a little like a cigar. The buzz of his breakfast went to his stomach and hit hard, but it evened out the feverish chill of his nerves. Although shaded by the train, the effervescent steam from his coffee still traced beautiful swirls in the crisp air. A pair of young couples spilled out of the doorway onto the wrought iron platform, barely glancing at him as they gathered against the rails. His hackles raised at the flashes of a gray uniform, but he calmed himself. All the fighting to be done over that color was long past for him. Leave it to younger men to brawl over such things. Although the newly arrived party all shared one face, the same face, decorated love-struck blue eyes and cruelly perfect chins, they held themselves in distinction. One of the women was dressed in the height of fashion, a green silk dress, polished brown leather boots with shapely arched heels, pearly curls of white ruffle fabric leaping like sea foam from a cresting green wave at her neck and ankles. Her man had a close-cropped layer of fine hairs under a gray kepi cap. A junior officer's uniform, certainly, recycled for fashion or cheapness by the army, shading his peach-smooth skin, against which high and firm cheekbones rose. His back was tall and powerful, especially compared to the slumping shorter figure, a decade older, whose flesh seemed to hang from his face like saddlebags or sacks of grain. They had the same bones underneath, it seemed, but the older and shorter man had thick golden curls halfway down his face, a straw mop of dirty hay covering his head. How the service used up the youth, he thought. That was a man who had seen the frontier, maybe with the cavalry. His spouse, older and thin, even thinner in comparison to Straw Mop's stumpy appearance, reminded him somehow of a heron, gracefully composed, ready to kill with a glance of cruel gray-blue eyes. He nodded to the man, younger than he was, despite his sagging figure, and touched his cap to the kid. The couples nodded back and resumed a low chatter, gazing down the rails, perhaps reminiscing on the civilized world they had just left. The couples were very engrossed in themselves, and for a second he felt a sense of shame. But in the end, he was an officer, and more importantly, on a mission of his own, and so he did interrupt. He coughed loudly over his little cigar, and then drained his coffee before turning to them. Fair warning, Joe figured. Then he launched his direct question. Have you all seen any riders, horsemen riding around the train? All the faces turned towards him, flashing with annoyance at this interruption. Fuck them, Joe knew. He was within his rights. After a pause, Straw Mop tried to plug the breaches in etiquette, extending his hand and introducing himself as Peter, the gray eminence as his wife, unnamed, his brother Frank, and his fiancée, and then a pause, as if to cue a response from Joe. With a casual salute, Joe rattled off, Commodore Josiah Wenchler, Naval Intelligence, in the sternest voice he could, and then pulled out a pad for notes. I could ask for your full names, Peter, and keep them to check on, but I'd prefer to keep this informal. And then more gently followed, So, have you seen any strange riders about? You know anybody in the area, any family or anything? Scaring the hell out of hick farmers was always fun. Sure, many of them had put in 3 years of service, drinking in forts, pretending to keep the frontier sealed, before skedaddling off to a nice plot of land, fertilized with blood from the Red Wars and the Turf Wars and the bushwhacking and the feuding and the civil thing. But, hell, he had seen too many corpses, too many wasting slaves to really give a fuck. He let them try and carve a little slice of life out of the bloody land. So, let him remind them that it was wolves with guns, like him, who let them. They always folded quickly after that. Who knew what uniformed dicks could get away with? And besides, he was still authoritative enough. They were all staked out in the rear passenger carriage, but the dumpy blonde had noticed torches moving along the train in the night. Came to realize he might have known a man who'd settled down on a plot or on a different train line. Not this one, no. Much further south, sure. But the realization maybe stalled trains like this were big ways to sell produce from the farms, much closer than shipping it out to one of the industrial freight hubs. Maybe if a train got stuck, well, an easier market than trucking it hundreds of miles to some loading station. Joe mulled this over, alone, on the platform, his little cigar shrinking down to a tiny nub of gray and black. After thinking everything over twice, hell, who knew how many times he'd thought it over, he re-entered the darkness of the carriage. It smelled. After almost a week, smelled like food and sweat and farts, like people who didn't shower enough. A society had started to bud in the long waiting process, people taking walks along the tracks, making acquaintances, fucking in the bathrooms. They all looked the same to him, and he tried to ignore them entirely, their smell, their presence, the meaning of their being here on these two spindly tracks of steel in the middle of this wasteland of corn and steppe prairie, dotted with dying groves. It meant nothing to him. Maybe it wasn't even real. Suddenly, his face was slamming into the polished oak flooring, the smell of resin and shoe soles cramming into his nose. He pushed himself up awkwardly, feeling out of shape, and rose to see Peter Froman, the straw mop of a fat fucking farmer, pretending to store with a stumpy leg stuck out into the aisle. On impulse, his hand almost dropped to his belt, but, for dramatic flair, he grabbed his wrist with his left to restrain himself. Soured over the apparition of incontrovertible reality, and not a little humiliated, he goose-stepped loudly back to his cabin, slammed the door, and searched, going through long lists, pages and pages of figures about the local farming product. Night again. Joe groaned and rolled over, fumbling for the watch from his pocket, the once neat pressed blue of his uniform dissolving into waves, ripples, and crags. By phosphorescent tinted tines, he could guess that it was 4 a.m. A new bottle rolled, almost empty, across the bed sheets. He picked it up, drained it, and was about to nod back to sleep when a flash caught his eye. Like a comet, low on the horizon at first, a torchlight flickered solitary in the distance. A flash, and then another joined it, and then more. A sense of panic, the unknown in this savage place, struck him. Somewhere in the whiskey-wet recess of his mind, a flicker of neurons burst to recognition. No way to ship and sell extra produce out here in this savage landscape. Too far to transport fragile eggs, spoiling fruits, anything but salted meat, grain, and liquor to the mega stations of the freight lines. They had to sell the excess to meet the tax burden. How else could they have done it? Back when slave power had tried to secure itself, provoking the civil thing, brigades and conscript drafts had learned to break up the rail lines, twist the tracks around trees, move them, block a train from getting through. It would make too much sense that they'd keep those memories, those skills, and they'd use them before letting their families collapse under the post-war tax burden. Under all the costs it took to keep the endlessly bloody frontier closed to the ever resistant Reds, it was probably all too easy to get a group together and sell goods while the train was disrupted. Who could complain there? Let alone finger a good, honest man for something that a lone bandit or marauding savage had done. Hell, you might even get them to pay for a militia. The torches were getting closer. Of course, what stopped you from simply bushwhacking a train, killing everyone and taking all the money? Sure, it might bring down some heat, but well, why sell so much booze and food to the train first? Maybe to calm people down before a strike? It still seemed wasteful. He reached for his little cigars and remembered he was inside and the hassle getting kicked off here would entail. He put his hand down, rolled off his jacket, put on his tight boots, and then stretched himself back into the bed. No need to worry about the paranoid fantasies when paranoid realities watched him just down the corridor. Either they'd get him while he slept, or they wouldn't, and no worrying would help here. He woke up late in the morning, head pounding, and blurred memories of fires on the horizon jolting him upright. Finding the compartment a messy heap as it ever was, he felt calm. A little black coffee later, the call of nature drove him to take a walk down the rails before a grove of yew. The fresh air did him good, clearing out the poisons of the night before, giving him space to question the dreamlike glimpses of memory into the whiskey gauze coating of the recent days. He was beginning to doubt the existence of any riders at all when he stumbled across strange markings in the soft autumn dirt of a yew copse. U-shaped horse tracks confirmed that the riders weren't a delusion. Also there was the jewel weed. Even in the forests of youth with the wandering birds, orange-flowered snap pods had left their mark. They weren't everywhere, of course, but on the edges of the yew groves, their flaming beauty was spent peeking out through the fall until pop, 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 their ripe pods would push out, sending seeds zooming off. Fun games for children to play, but as anyone who had ever hunted or spent much time in the ranging forces knew, they were sure ways of tracking. The springs dried out rapidly after shooting the seeds, so you could use ripples of spent pods as evidence of movement, like a body-littered battlefield or a cartridge-littered crime scene after some fight. His dawn wander at the tracks revealed snap paths of jewelweed among the straight rows of trees, signs of incursion in swaths that crept ever closer to the carriages. He slipped into a gentle stroll, meandering with so late a start as to find the evening chill of fall descending still away from the train. As the sun lowered, the days were already feeling shorter. Joe spent less than half the day bathing in its warmth, gathering the medicinal sunshine, and more than half of it spent shielded and drunk in the stalled iron horse. Lonely carriages in red enamel and black wrought iron stood isolated on the vastness of the plain. Cold metal skin and weak glass stretched thin on the scar of a train track, silent except the occasional gust of wind or the roar of the passing freight. It felt fragile enough that even a single bullet might rip through, bleeding the half-wild expanse into the iron crate of civilized life. Once upon a time, train windows had been much thicker, part of an armor fit more for some medieval steed than this engine of progress. But as the country had settled into its new civilization, found its new culture, its new kinds of possession, the cost in coal and time had meant the thick slits of steel were replaced with great flat planes of glass, screens through which passed the haunting panorama of the land to the flowing rivers of passengers. Like the change from old Latin temples of thick stone walls to the shapely Gothic arches where light flowed in, new illuminations heralded a change in the hearts of the men facing them. Life inside the carriages was feeling the staleness of the wait. It was hard to see how they could stand to wait longer still for the repair teams to reach them. Already, the people who he returned to seemed more distant and withdrawn, alternating bouts of boisterous overexposure with fearful exclusion. He couldn't imagine the rail would stay closed into the November rains or the December drafts, but he didn't imagine it could have taken a week to do anything like this either. Perhaps in days long gone, a swashbuckling commodore might have organized pioneer teams of young men on the train to guard the perimeter, search the forests, and protect the fort. Today, it was just policy to maintain a low profile, he told himself. It was important. A deeper fear lurked in the depths of his soul, blocking him from organizing anything besides a glass of muddy apple liquor. Joe sat staring at it in silence as the stars came out and the little lights flickered to life behind the windows of the train. Early the next morning, he got up as had become habit. Brig-like comfort from the contained compartment eased his sleep well past the dawn. No clatter of hooves to interrupt the constant cycle of freight cars on the further track. Each fresh moment of waking struck him with the same notion. It was all fantastic. Silent men in black with notepads, inexhaustible supplies of liquor, bands of horsemen riding out from the past, delays where no one else, passenger or steward, noticed or cared. The strange gray man outside who had never rematerialized. Worse, his mind felt like it was slipping, like he hadn't kept it sharp amidst the clatter of the big industrial cattle cars and the slosh of hard liquor. All the forms of endless prairies and the patches of aging yews, each new day of waiting, isolation in his compartment, staring at numbers and pages of charts, hoping for some mystical breakthrough to emerge to reveal him with its truth, but no inner knowledge had appeared to wipe away the wasted time. The train delay hadn't killed his schedule, entirely anyway. He could cut his vacationing at a couple spots short as he made his way out to his post. Still, someone somewhere was bleeding time from him, days from his life. Enough with this looking at maps. The late starts were like barnacles on a hull, encroaching, fouling it, making each day later and slower than the last, each day a faster descent into the comfort of a bottle. A spurt of rage erupted suddenly, and he snatched up the only full bottle left to him, unstoppered it, and started to pour the contents out of the train window. A gust of cool air from the pre-dawn plain hit his face, and a shock of recognizable déjà vu came to him and restored his senses. He had seen his old man do this same impotent gesture before, pulling his head out of a drunken gutter on some brief visit home, only to plunge back in when he returned to that love of his life, frontier duty. Back on the plain, half erect, out the side of the lonesome train, he gazed at a shattered glass pile, scattering into little crevasses and dimples of the railroad ballast. No city service around here to get rid of the waste, to take away the glass memories of shame. He wished the train would jolt forward, pull him away from this spot. Hadn't the farmers bled enough of his time, bled enough of his money, more than their reasonable share? Surely the big passenger lines had to at least pretend to meet the time schedules. Yesterday, had he also claimed, as he was putting aside the bottle to think through this? He couldn't really remember the date they had embarked, and although he could probably find a copy of the ticket stub, anything, it might be fabricated. He had no handwritten journal, no memorable landmark in time, just patchy recollections. God, was this the break that would... No. Still. The wine was gone. Drinking was becoming a liability, even on a carefree vacation. It had been a mistake to think anything could be carefree these days, especially with his project. hurtling eternally onward to the edge of the socialized world. If he had to give it up again, he would. He had beaten this before. He could do it again. He needed to. His cause needed it. God, he, demanded it. He tossed the bottles over the windsill. Not littering, he said to himself. The glass comes from the rocks. In boats, it's tossed over to help make the sea glass, the amber jewels in blue seas, the greens and browns and purples that children love to search the sand for. We are just as much a cycle as the rocks or the dirt. Who would step on it here? Only a careless, greedy bandit. Or a farmer. The strange man, fading in and out from the mist of memory, in and out of the shadows of yew copses beyond the train, a man like that would look where he stepped. He forgot the misdemeanor and turned to straightening out the cabin, crimping sheets, clearing out tabs of files. Sorting through the paper in his briefcase for the 100th time, barely able to remember why or what he had looked at them for in the first place, ate up most of his day. Detailed topographic maps, fresh from surveys, gardens of colors scattering across them, showing old tribes, old boundaries, new settlements, new pioneer paths, rails, lines in red and blue, the arteries and veins that carried the blood of a nation, which pumped them every day further and further afield, with every breath bringing new life to the world. Now, even the furthest edges had too much color, too many detail. It was easier these days, with new ways of carrying information and people, for them to spread out. So much faster than the first wave of horse-drawn cannons and grim men relying on the natural bounty of whoever had been farming or hunting or herding when they had first arrived. Hard to believe that it had been done. Stolen survey maps, state secrets, crumbling paper and rain-smeared ink. A truly Herculean task to break this wild country back in those days. It couldn't stop the waves of people settling down on the land like sunbeams, traveling across desolate space, soaking in dust, bringing their civilization to these foreign wastes, farms and plows and healthy cattle, making sure every child had a full plate and a good education. Every proper child. But even today, who would bother teaching letters to a beef bull or a slave? Only the most fundamental Bible thumpers, the ambitious lovers of efficiency hoping to find unpaid secretaries. Dizzying, he thought, as he shuffled and swiped through the waves of information each map contained. The files sorted themselves into their places slowly, building a narrative in their folders as much as in his neurons. Table clear, cabin clean. He set about cleaning his handgun, soaking up the grease scent with his nose, making sure each piece was well prepared for anything to come. Darkness hadn't fully fallen when a plume of white steam from the front of the train signaled their advance. Repair crews must have finally figured out that they were needed. Impossible to know why, and unhealthy to let speculation sow deeper the seeds of paranoia. After all, they were on the move again. Movement in the train jerked him forward, rolling him into the embrace of a mattress, a great tumbling down into the solace of sleep's solitude. Rushing along the gentle curve of the steel road, the bunk mimicked the sway of the sea, each rattle of steel a wave felt in every swing of the downy mattress. The sun rays spread from beyond the clear horizon, through purple heather flowers, past curves in his closed eyes, becoming waves of salty motion deep in his skull. Amidst wildflowers and grasses, dark red rose burst forth in a field. Some line of corpses, watered with the blood of the few untamed savages left. No, not here. Still so far from the new frontier. Not in these later days. Every breathing thing had been bought and sold and butchered and pushed, always further and always further to the edges of the land itself. Row after row of them, ripe berries like fronds of pink fluff, pushed past the deep red leaves. It was early for the harvests, But even so, he could still see the field workers pushed like chattels, snapping the heads of amethyst branches of grain close to the large field houses. He chuckled and shook his head. Amaranth. The things even these big plantations grew today. Easier to dry and ship than a fresh apple tart, for sure. He chuckled, imagining the homeowner trying to organize the hands into a sabotage team to sell off bulk red grain and offering bribes of health foods to rail stewards as if it was something fit to serve on a rail car. These days, though, even big plots owned by men with big names might find trouble selling on contract to the cities if they didn't own some stake in the freight lines. This land was still changing, and who knew if there'd be more hell to pay than a week-long delay on a train. It had happened before. With a steaming cup of espresso for company, there was a rabbit hole to explore. He checked the ticket copies and the listed itineraries for the trains headed out towards the great mountain foothills. There was a train every couple of weeks, maybe exactly every 13 days to be precise, but with delays like this, who really knew? With luck on his side, there'd be one departing tonight. In that case, the reluctantly approaching stop would offer just a few hours. God willing, it would be enough time to drop off the packages to the people there he knew, and then slip onwards away towards his post. If he was lucky, he could even lose his tail again in the bustle of a bigger station, choked with freight cars and loading crews. Joe checked that his watch was set, and then walked, without tripping, to the rear platform. Pale gold sunshine floated in the morning air, and a fresh wind from the wilderness carried the late sweetness of flowers, leaving a slight chill to burn off any lingering summer heat across the flat land. Time moved on, one watch tick at a time, one spin of the steel wheels on the track, one solar rotation after another, and with that slow constancy achieved, all would be well. The yew-furnished Baroque cabinet which bore him ever on rolled.